Hello, good afternoon, and welcome. You're listening to Business Savvy Coach here on WDJY 99.1 FM, where we educate business professionals to succeed. I am your host, Cheryl Gowdy. Thank you so much for joining us. Storytelling. What comes to your mind when I say storytelling? For some of you, it may be humor, laughter, a message, a lesson, or something else. However you perceive it, storytelling is the expression of events in words and images, often by improvisation or exaggeration. We know that the primary purpose is to engage the listener with what is being said. According to the Center for Narrative Leadership, a good story not only engages the imagination of the listener, but also reveals the speaker's passion or lack of it. If you were to walk into any corporation, big or small, and did a straw poll that included a question about communication, it would be fair to assume that the need for better communication would end up being close to the top of the list of actions for that company. Communication experts have argued that effective communication requires leaders to use multiple communication channels, being face-to-face conversations, telephone calls, email, letters, brochures, reports, and the internet, to name just a few, to communicate their message. So given the challenges associated with communication in the workplace, any approach that facilitates engagement with what is being said is worth considering further. On today's show, we'll be considering the question, how do you use storytelling to increase the effectiveness of your sales force? The purpose of this show is to increase your awareness of the influence of storytelling on the effectiveness of the sales force. Later in the show, I'll be joined by my guest, Kevin Pitts, who will examine this issue in more detail. You're listening to Business Savvy Coach here on WDJY 99.1 FM. We need to take a short break, so stay tuned to Business Savvy Coach here on WDJY 99.1 FM. I am your host, Cheryl Gowdy. We'll be right back after this message. Welcome back to the show. If you're just joining us, good afternoon. You're listening to Business Savvy Coach here on WDJY 99.1 FM. I am your host, Cheryl Gowdy. In today's show, we're examining how storytelling can increase the effectiveness of the sales force. I am delighted to have as my guest today Kevin Pitts of Performance Consulting Group. Kevin, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Great. So Kevin is a seasoned leader, consultant, facilitator, adjunct faculty member of Drexel University and moderator for Harvard Business Publishing, and has led workshops and coached executives across the country. Kevin attended the College of Darren School of Business at the University of Virginia, where he received an MBA with a concentration in finance/organizational behavior, and Colgate University, from which he received a BA in philosophy. Kevin is a PhD candidate at the University of Pittsburgh in the area of strategic management with an emphasis on execution. In addition to his academic studies, Mr. Pitts has published several articles in areas such as business strategy, total quality management, environmental scanning, and decision making. Kevin, it would be useful to share with the audience what journey led you to where you are today.
I've been thinking about what we actually do in the sales context to actually win business.
Yes.
And when it comes down to it, and when I do my post-audit on myself, or if I'm coaching others and listening to what they're doing in real time in front of clients, those that win a lot of business are those that tell an effective story. Because when you think about it, it's really getting rapport with people, and getting people engaged in what you have to offer. And it's through storytelling that we actually get that rapport. And it's just by, looking at what creates success that has led me to this journey around storytelling.
That's absolutely useful, and I'm sure will be insightful as we go through the interview this afternoon. So just to make sure we have a shared understanding, when you refer to storytelling, exactly what do you mean?
Yeah, I think of a story as a detailed, character-based narration of a client's struggle to reach a certain goal. And then how is that overcome by either the characters in the story or the team that's working on the problem, if you will. And so it really is this detailed character-based narration of a struggle to overcome certain barriers to reach an important goal.
Right.
And, in a sales context, if you can talk about what, your organization has done to overcome certain barriers in an organization to help them reach their goals, obviously that's what people are looking for, and that's what they buy.
And so what I'm hearing is that there's an association with the message I to provide or engage the listener with the practical side of it, but it's just presented in a way that is more engaging. Is that correct?
Absolutely. I mean, think about, like I'm from Brooklyn, New York originally, and I go back and I see people that I grew up with. We're just kind of standing around and we haven't seen each other in years, and we begin to tell each other stories.
Yes.
And it's really, story is how we think and how we relate to people. And so, we do it in many, many contexts, whether it's a sales meeting, customer service, problem-solving situation, whether it's in marketing about the value propositions and how that works, and where we forge partnerships. And so story pervades, our human existence.
Great. You appear to suggest that storytelling is a skill. What influenced this conclusion?
Well, going back to when we are just gathered around, whether it's a dinner table, whether it's a sales meeting, or whether it's just seeing some old friends, and, somebody begins to tell a story, and the story kind of fell flat, right? It really didn't make the point. and we've all been in that situation, right?
I'm sure we have.
Absolutely. And I've been in that situation in a sales context where somebody's telling a story and that person's part of my team, and I know it's kind of falling flat, and I just want to interrupt and jump in, but can't do it because that wouldn't be respectful. And so, when I came to this journey around storytelling and the importance of it, and there's other important things, obviously. I mean, for your sales audience and those that are listening is very, very important. And we'll talk about that hopefully some point in time. So, and yet, at some point in time, the salesperson has to say something.
Yes. And,
what is it that you're going to say that will influence the buyer to take action?
Yes.
And so I've come to this conclusion around storytelling in and of itself, because I've heard so many stories just fall flat. And so telling an effective story really increases the probability for success in a sales situation. And in many situations. I mean, in any situation where you're gathering rapport or want somebody engaged in what you have to say, an effective story certainly helps.
Great. And I can see, and I'm sure my listeners will be able to understand that there's a particular skill about it. So it's not just communicating information, but it's communicating information in a way that is engaging, but also is on point with regards to what the person, whether it's a sales force or it's a public speaker, is trying to engage the audience. That's my conclusion that I've drawn from that. Is that a correct assumption?
Absolutely. And let me even build on that. When you think about an effective story, there are three things that have to happen at a minimum. You have to have the why of the story, and that basically tells the reader, why should I care?
Yes.
Why would I care about that? And obviously in a sales situation, you're trying to get a customer to buy something, they want to know, well, why should I care about what you have to sell me? And then it's the how of the situation. And the question is, how will this improve my life? Or in a sales situation, how will this improve our lot here in this company? Or, this particular function's effectiveness or the productivity of the organization. And then the last thing is the what. What then must I do? If I truly believe that I should care and this will improve my life, what must I do? In some point in time, we'll talk a little bit about the brain science underneath what it means to be a human being, because that plays a role, too, in this notion of effective storytelling.
Without a doubt. And I think I like the point that you've just mentioned, which is the what, which is the call to action.
Absolutely.
So whilst you're telling a story, it is designed to achieve a particular goal, and that goal is to ensure that stage, the listener is very clear about what it is that you expect them to do. So from your perspective, what do you perceive then are the barriers to telling effective stories? And you mentioned some great examples earlier.
The barriers, there are many. Mm-hmm. The first one being time. To tell an effective story, it takes a moment. And even though you can tell a great story in 2 minutes, in 30 seconds, in a minute, in 20 minutes, in an hour, for some reason we believe that it's going to take too much time to really create the context, build up the characters, talk about the conflict, then talk about the solution and the change that's needed, and then the carry out message. And we'll come back to that, because those are my 6 C's of effective story. But the first barrier is I don't think I have enough time, or I think I'm going to bore the person because I'm not an effective communicator. To be a great salesperson, you have to be an effective communicator. You have to be a great listener. You have to be a great listener too. And so all of you who are sitting there saying, "Oh, I've always thought that listening is so important," absolutely critical. But at some point, the client wants to hear what you have to say. Mm-hmm. You have to open up your mouth and say something. And the question is, what will that be? And so my first point is time. Yes. The second point is we're in the bullet point world. And when you open up your mouth, is it a series of bullet points, or are you telling an effective story?
Yes.
And that's, we learn when we're young, coming out of college, okay, how do we, in college, by the way, this is fascinating, even as kids and in grade school and junior high school and high school and college, we learn to write and tell great stories.
We did.
I need the essay. I need this book report. I need this thesis. It's a great story. Yes. But when we come to the business world, because of this notion of time, the bullet point shows up. And it's like, listen, I don't have time to hear your story. I need the 5 key bullet points. I'll create my own story. The fascinating thing is the reason why we do that is to say, listen, I'm going to create my own story from your bullet points.
Yes.
Because that's how we think and that's how we relate, but just give me the bullet points.
Yes.
Well, unfortunately, the bullet point world is a barrier for us in a sales context to creating effective stories. And then it's just a communication skills. I mean, knowing that, a good story, especially in a sales context, has a little bit of a conflict, a barrier, as you've just asked me. Some sort of complication that your solution can overcome. Otherwise, why buy it? Yeah. Now, there are some situations that you say, listen, you are successful, and I just want to make you even more successful. Yeah, that's great, and I got that. And to me, that's more of a play on words than really providing a solution to a problem. Yeah. Yet, there is some sort of barrier that shows up in an organization, and they're looking for solutions. There are problems, and they're looking for solutions, and the question is, do you have one for them? So, just being able to communicate what your offering does for the client is very important. And then the whole notion of a structure of a story. Yeah. And you might not know what that structure is. And I've alluded to it, but, here are my 6 C's. There's context, there's characters, there's a conflict, there's a cure, you want me to change something, and then there's the carry-outness. And that could be done quickly or a little longer, just depends. And so the structure is important, and understanding that and not understanding that creates a barrier to telling an effective story. And last but not least, the notion that story is important because we do it naturally, right? In many cases, we do it naturally, and so we take it for granted. So just to really say, you know what, I really believe that we need to go back to our roots. It's almost putting the creativity and the innovation back into the sales process, where we're telling great stories about how how our solutions have overcome various problems in organizations, and getting rid of the bullet point notion or the bullet point aspect of business. It has its place, absolutely.
Absolutely, yes, yeah.
Yet, at certain times we need to take a moment and tell the story.
I really like that, and I'm sure the audience will too, this sense of bringing back the creativity and innovation, which we know that is where success lies for individuals, for businesses, for companies, for corporations. And removing that has been a major part of the challenge. And you talked about the bullet point world, which is the speed. Everything has to be done quickly, and the thought process that is needed for the creativity and innovation. I'm delighted that you're saying here the storytelling brings that back into the workplace, in particular in this context for the sales force. I think that's a great point. And certainly we'll come back to those core points you talked about, the key C's there, because, again, I think that would be a good framework for our listeners to follow through. So how, from your perspective, then, how can all individuals overcome these barriers?
First, practicing. And, there are a number of books. I mean, I think one of the books that I might even have, like, I don't know what it's called exactly, but, it's like Storytelling for Dummies, all those dummy books, right?
Yes.
So Budget for Dummies and all that. And when it gets to that point where you have like storytelling for dummies, that it's important because they usually do important things, right, to make sure that the masses understand it. And so certainly, doing a bit of research, reading some articles about how to tell an effective story or getting some books could be helpful. And just realizing that you need to practice. You need to recognize that it's important and then practice. A lot of times telling an effective story is really about effective communication. And when you take the communication training classes, you obviously get a chance to videotape yourself and practice telling great stories, although they don't focus on the storytelling aspect of it. They focus on the presentation aspect of it. And so, then focus on the storytelling aspect in your practice.
Yes.
Okay, take some notes for yourself. What is the context you want to bring up? Who are the characters? How will you pretty much, either role play that through your voice, your tone, your hands? How would you build up the characters and the different characters that might have been a part of this? How would you describe the conflict that your solution overcame, and maybe in a referenced organization, et cetera, and so on. And so, practice makes perfect. And understanding the structure of a good story, which is where training comes in. We do some training around storytelling. We've got a program that helps you effectively tell a story, and part of that program is a lot of practice also. So you get a chance to see yourself telling a story. And we don't focus so much on, are your hands behind your back? Or, are you doing a lot of ums? I'm sure I'm doing some of them. Right? But we really focus on the story itself and, how effective is the story itself.
I like that because, again, it just enables or encourages the storyteller to focus on this story rather than all those distractions that are taking place around them. Kevin, that's been absolutely useful. We need to take a short break. However, before we go, can you please tell listeners how they may get in touch with you?
Oh, certainly. You can email me at kevin.pitts@gmail.com, and certainly can call me. I'm kind of old-fashioned. I'm old school. There's no reason why you can't call me, and it's 215-327-6067. And just say, hey, man, I heard you on the radio, and you were talking about storytelling. I'd like to talk to you more about that. So certainly through email, and give me a call. We'd be more than happy to chat.
Great.
You're listening to Business Savvy Coach here on WDJY 99.1 FM. We need to take a short break, so stay tuned to Business Savvy Coach here on WDJY 99.1 FM. I am your host, Cheryl Gowdy. We'll be right back after this message. Welcome back to the show. If you're just joining us, good afternoon. You're listening to Business Savvy Coach here on WDJY 99.1 FM. I am your host, Cheryl Gowdy.
I'm delighted you could join us today. I'm currently speaking with my guest, Kevin Pitts, about the value of storytelling in helping to increase the effectiveness of the sales force. And so far we've heard it's not just the sales force that could benefit, it could result in a lifelong positive skill in how we communicate with each other. So continuing in that vein, Kevin, can you provide our listeners with examples of effective storytelling?
Yes, I can. And I'm not going to tell you one of my stories or whether it's, one of the aspects of the story, it needs to be relevant. Yes. I'm sure you have listeners all over. But, I mean, when you think about TED Talk and you look at some of the, hopefully your listeners understand, and know a little bit about those TED Talks, and most of us would have come across them. Those are folks who tell a pretty good story.
Yes.
And so TED Talks are great. YouTube, when you think about all of YouTube, in many cases, it's a story. And so many of us now have smartphones, and we can access YouTube, and you can, if you look at the structure of a story, context, characters, conflict, the cure, the change, and the carry-out message, in many cases, the YouTube, whatever's there, is a story, and it follows a pretty effective structure. Now, obviously, there's some bad YouTube out there.
I'm afraid so.
I'm afraid so. But you can find some effective stories on YouTube. Story pervades our life. And if you just listen for it, you'll hear it. And so, there's many places I would certainly do those TED Talks. They seem to be certainly one avenue of effective story.
Oh, that's great. And so at least our audience can find that resource that's useful. So what would you say to someone who currently is listening to us and would say, storytelling is of little value in the sales arena? What would you say to that person?
I would say, okay, great. Allow me to go with you on a sales call.
Yes.
And I'm just going to listen to the person. And I'll jot down each and every story that they tell, whether it's effective or not.
Yes.
And unfortunately, we don't assess ourselves like that in many cases on the sales call, unless we, have a team and the team gives each other feedback.
Mm-hmm.
But every sales call I've been on, I've heard a lot of stories. And so how can you not say it's not important?
Yeah.
Now, let's just take the sales cycle for a second.
Yes.
And I'm going to do a generic sales cycle, right? Exploration, dialogue, commitment, follow-up. Mm-hmm. In the exploration stage, you learn that you need to establish rapport. Well, how would you do that? How would you establish rapport? You can do it a number of ways. But one way is tell a story of how your interest might align with the client's interest.
Yeah.
And so I remember, when I'm going to age myself here. I remember many, many years ago in training and insurance company and sales, they said when you walk in the office, look around and see the pictures and what the client has up in their office and find something to kind of break the ice. And, I had clients who had little small trophies of golf, and I'm a big golfer. And so, I would go in and I'd tell a story about one of my golf episodes. And it typically was a story where, I was doing bad, and then I, somehow fixed it, and
yes.
and it got better, or maybe it just stayed bad, but I certainly changed my objective. I changed my objective, and I just said, listen, let's just have fun, and I can at least succeed in that.
Yes.
And so, when you're establishing rapport, you are telling probably a story in most cases. And then in the exploration stage, you are, asking the client a lot of questions around their needs, and they're probably telling you a story. A story about, hey, there's a problem in the organization, and then they just embark on this story.
Yes.
And then you're there listening to their story. And so certainly, when you first start the sales cycle, there's a lot of stories being told. And then in the dialogue section, where you might have identified the specific need, and you are talking about, and the client could be talking about their challenges and barriers to why things aren't happening effectively.
Yeah.
And they could also be challenging you in the advice you've given them. And so the whole notion of objection handling, when the client says, great, that's great advice, but here's an objection or here's a barrier to what you've just said, you typically go right into a story around how it was overcome, this particular situation that the client is feeling or seeing. It was overcome by other clients.
Yeah.
It's kind of like we learn this in sales, the feel, felt, and found kind of way. You might say something, I understand how you can feel that way, and other clients have felt that way, but what we have found is, and you go into your story.
Yeah.
And that's one of the ways to deal with objections. And then during the commitment phase, when they are, pretty much saying, okay, great, I'm believing in your story and how you can help us. Yeah. And then you start thinking about the future. and now you're creating this vision story. So great. Here's what we're trying to accomplish, and here's what it will look like once we've executed on this solution. And you start talking about the vision story. So, I just would have a hard time understanding how someone can't see how story is probably part of the foundation of what it means to be an effective salesperson. Just think about it. You learn about objection handling. That is typically a story. You learn about identifying the client's needs and then listening to their story.
Yeah.
You learn about basically story after story after story, and so
yes, like story upon story upon story, a whole composite of story. But within that, it's the message, and as you said, the why, the how, but more importantly, the what is focused in that process. I think that's just a great way of demonstrating the value of storytelling, and I'm sure that our listeners will be able to see that relevance. So how can corporations or organizations equip individuals to be better storytellers?
Yeah, obviously, many organizations have a sales training curriculum, and if I was the VP of sales somewhere, I would certainly have storytelling as being one of the core workshops that all of the sales force would need to go through, because they would all have to be able to tell an effective story.
Yes.
I also think that we do it so naturally, and yet we don't really do it enough. One of the things that I think is important for organizations is to tell the historical story to its sales force of all the key events that led up to where we are today. So they have context about what to actually communicate to the clients, and all the different wonderful success stories that has happened to date to create a General Electric, an IBM, even a small company, and so, corporations have their stories, and yet they don't effectively communicate it themselves to their employees. So recognizing that story is so important in getting people aligned and engaged in coming to your organization to work. Whether it's the story about how we respect diversity, whether it's the story around how we lead, whether it's the story or how we came to being. I remember, and again, I'm going to age myself, I was a consultant at GE, or a trainer, and they talked about numerous Jack Welch stories. Jack did this and Jack did that. But they said it in the story. It was kind of like corporate lore, if you will. Those stories really pervaded what it meant to be part of GE.
Oh, great. That's fine. So what tips would you provide to someone who would like to be a better storyteller? And you've given us some hints earlier in the show, but just for those who've just joined us, what tips would you provide?
Few things. First, once you recognize that it's so important, read up on it. There are a number of great books out there around telling effective stories.
Yes.
Then obviously practice. But there are a number of classic storytelling frameworks that I think if you should internalize. So for instance, for me, there's the shares model, where you're setting up the setting, the hindrance, then the action, then the results.
Yes.
And then there's the Parlance model, where you have a problem, an action, a result, a learning, an application, and suggestion actions. And then there's charges, where you have the context. So these are all acronyms that I use to kind of make sure that I tell an effective story. Right? And the one that I like is called CALLS. It's context, challenge, action, result, lessons learned, and suggested actions.
Yes.
And so just having, a basic story structure in your mind that you can remember, because as you begin telling the story naturally, then it'll just pop in, and you'll just naturally know that, okay, I'm going to set the scene. I'm going to, something's going to happen. We're going to have some conflict. There'll be some barriers. We're going to overcome it. There's a resolution. There's some new insights are gained, and there's a parting message. And just knowing that structure and internalizing it will help you tell an effective story.
Great. Absolutely wonderful insight for our listeners. So What should sales leaders do immediately to help their troops tell better stories?
Well, first, they have to recognize that stories are important because they humanize the relationship. See, stories humanize us and help us form connections with people.
Mm-hmm.
And so once we truly believe that, we then recognize that, okay, we need to help our folks tell better stories.
Yes.
And so they need to, number one, what types of stories does everybody, whether it's in the sales force or as leaders, our leaders need to have kind of in their hip pocket the solution story, the reference story, the vision story, the management story, the leadership story. I mean, there's a set of stories that probably we can identify for various different functions in an organization. Like you're in R&D, there's that one product success story that we all talk about. If you're in sales, there's those reference stories that we have.
Yes.
So first identify, okay, let's say if I'm a sales leader, my sales force need to have in their hip pocket that reference story around this particular solution.
Mm-hmm.
Then they have to have the vision story, what we're trying to accomplish as an organization so that we can share that with the client. The value story, what we stand for as an organization. The sales force needs to have that value story in their hip pocket, clearly internalized and to be able to communicate effectively. And so, there's just a number of stories they need to have and that they can internalize that we know just by going through numerous sales cycles that they're going to need at some point in time in that sales cycle. So leaders need to identify what are the types of stories our sales force needs to understand. And then we need to script them out. I mean, I'm not the biggest fan of scripts, but we can script them out because some of the stories, they might not have the information. We might have it.
Yes.
And so some of these reference stories, these client success stories could have happened on the West Coast, but the folks on the East Coast know nothing about it. And we all understand how those regional dynamics work. And make sure that we script out all these different types of stories that we want everybody to understand. And then have, whether it's at a sales meeting or a specific training, have everybody understand those stories, internalize them, practice them.
Yes.
And in doing that, also learn a little bit about structures of stories and how to tell an effective story, so that it becomes almost second nature.
Yes.
For their folks.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Kevin. So what I'm hearing, it's really trying to integrate the culture of storytelling within the organization, starting not only with the corporate perspective, but the client stories, the reference stories as you described them, and making sure that they are fluent when the sales force speaks about them. And you talked about making sure that it's written down where possible and practice. And I think that's just a great way. So for those who are more reflectors in their personality type, they would already have captured that information compared to those who think out loud, who would find it quite easy to make up the story as they go along. So what I'm hearing, it's just a great way to engage with the workforce and also ensure that they are communicating that message. That's wonderful. So before we go, Kevin, can you just tell our listeners how they might reach you if they would like more information again?
You can reach me at kevin.pitts@gmail.com. And also, reach out. Reach out in a phone call, 215-327-6067.
Kevin, I'm delighted to have you as a guest on our show today. This is personally a very interesting topic for me, not because I tell a lot of stories, but I also recognize the value of storytelling. And it is such a fundamental part of communication, which you've reinforced today. And I'm sure our audience, our listeners, will benefit enormously from this approach because it provides focus. It ensures that results are achieved. And we're all about facilitating results in the professional and business environment. Thank you once again.
Thank you.
You're listening to Business Savvy Coach here on WDJY 99.1 FM. We need to take a short break, so stay tuned to Business Savvy Coach here on WDJY 99.1 FM. I am your host, Cheryl Gowdy. We'll be right back after this message. Welcome back to the show. If you're just joining us, good afternoon. You're listening to Business Savvy Coach here on WDJY 99.1 FM. I am your host, Cheryl Gowdy. Earlier in the show, my guest Kevin Pitts talked about the use of storytelling to increase the effectiveness of the sales force. And I was completely engaged with what he said, and I hope you were too. He pointed out the need to ensure that the story has depth and structure to engage or sufficiently engage with the audience. He talked about 6 core C's that must be part of effective storytelling, being the context, the character, the conflict, the cure, the challenge, the carry-out message, i.e. what will you do at the end of presenting this elaborate and no doubt engaging story. And through that process of understanding or listening to Kevin, for those who joined us, you would have heard how important the story is in engaging the listener, but more important in helping to communicate that message. And we know, particularly for the sales force, the more dynamic your approach to communicating and engaging your audience, the greater the chance that you'll close the deal. This show is about facilitating success, and we want to ensure that as part of that process, you are very equipped. And storytelling, without a doubt, is one great way of doing that. And as my guest mentioned, for some people, it's very natural. They start a story and it's very clear, it's very engaging, you are in tune with what they're saying, and the conclusion is very clear. But for others, it takes some effort, it takes some time. They require time and attention to achieve the outcome they require. And so creating or using these models to structure your story is just a great way to make sure that it adds that value, that oomph that you're seeking to gauge. And I think it's very important to say that we all want to be engaging in our own way, whether we're talking to one person or we're talking to hundreds and thousands. The aim is to ensure that the story captivates your audience in a way that engages them or encourages them to continue to listen. What is very important, and I think from this show today, is that my guest Kevin, he's provided a number of useful models. He's also talked about ways to develop that skill, to read, to practice, to seek feedback, to ensure that your storytelling continues to improve and adds that effect. And more importantly, with these models, you can anchor your thoughts, and even if you're in a setting where you're nervous, it provides a framework with which to continue to give or present your story in a very convincing way, and also demonstrate to the listener how engaged you are or inspired by what you're saying. And that's also very important. So how can you make better stories, or how can you tell better stories? What sorts of stories might you wish to tell? Is it about the product that you're offering? Is it about the sales, the kinds or the quality of sales? What would you like to include in your story? What are you trying to resolve? i.e., as Kevin mentioned, what are you trying to cure? Because that is important in engaging the listener with your story, or in fact, ensures that the listener transitions from being a listener to becoming a customer or a client. So that cure, what will it repair, what will it change, is very important in doing that. So in thinking about the stories you might tell, again, making sure that that structure is part of it is very important. If you're uncomfortable about telling stories, what might be causing that discomfort? Is it your verbal communication? Is it the challenge of speaking publicly with confidence? Is it lack of confidence in your ability? Is it fear of public speaking? It might be fear of failure, fear of criticisms. No one likes to be criticized. Fear of the unknown, or the inability to improvise. Because to be a good storyteller, you can use a script and you can use the guides that Kevin talks about, but there is a need to ensure that you are able to add to that, embellish the story, as we would describe it sometimes, over-exaggerate some points to make sure that your message is clear and concrete, and that it's received by the recipient as you intended. And we talked in an earlier show about the importance of ensuring that as a good communicator, your message reaches the recipient as you intended. And storytelling is another great way of achieving that. But from my perspective, whatever the barrier associated with storytelling, it can transform the way you communicate. So taking steps to eliminate those barriers can significantly improve your storytelling. So for example, if it's a fear of criticism,
It means that you could improve that by seeking feedback from others. Someone you're comfortable with, someone you know would not tear you down or destroy your confidence. So you will present your story to them and seek feedback. You would try and in your own way improvise when you're in a safe environment. It's very easy to do that than trying to improvise when you're in front of a client, in front of an audience, because if that doesn't work there, you are likely to lose your confidence, or that could destroy your confidence. Is it fear of public speaking? And in an earlier show we talked about this. It's practicing seeking feedback and doing it clearly. And I would encourage, for those of you who are telling stories, tell stories that are associated with something you're passionate about. It will come back, or it will be received in such an inspiration and a natural way, rather than seeking to tell a story about something you're not familiar with. So transforming the way you communicate your message, be that to existing or potential client, is going to be an important part of the storytelling journey. I would encourage you to take a few minutes this week to reflect on the messages you are seeking to communicate and the ways that you've been communicating. Ask yourself, how could you improve this message? Could telling a story be the answer that you're looking for? And when you do that, then take the next steps. And as my guest Kevin says, make a script it, write it down if you're not comfortable ad-libbing, if you're not comfortable winging it. Write it down, put down your thoughts, make sure that you have the structure and that you're following through on the structure, and go on, conquer the world with your great and impressive stories.
If you have any questions about the points raised in the show, please contact me via the studio on 512-827-0505, extension 6806, and leave a message. Please spell any difficult names or words. It's been my absolute pleasure to be with you today. Thank you so much for joining us this week. I look forward to being with you at the same time next week here on WDJY 99.1 FM. I am Cheryl Gowdy, the host of Business Savvy Coach, wishing you a successful week. Until next